So we seem to know things about the world. You probably know what time your class starts tomorrow. You probably know what time you need to set your alarm for to get up for it. You probably know that it's generally colder in February than it is in July. And you probably know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow in the east and set in the west. You probably know other things like who the president is, or where your closest grocery store is. We all seem to know things about the world around us. But I'm going to actually argue that we don't know anything about the world around us. I'm going to argue that we don't know anything specifically about the physical world around us. So the title here is maybe a little overstated, because maybe we can know things about our internal world, our thoughts and our feelings and things like that, or things about immaterial things like 1 + 1 = 2, or all triangles have 3 sides. We can know those things, but I'm going to argue that we can't know anything about the external physical world. Skeptical arguments we're going to go over in this lecture starts with the idea that we get knowledge about the external world in one of 2 ways. The first way we get knowledge about the external world is through direct observation. So this is pretty much what it sounds like. This is directly observing what's going on using your sense organs and getting information that way. So that's how you know that you're watching this video. That's how you know that I'm wearing this jacket. That's how you know that the dog in the background is barking or something like that. You're using your sense organs to get information about the external world. So the second way that we get information from the external world is through inferential reasoning. So what this is to get an idea of what this is, consider this scenario. So you wake up overnight and you see that the trees outside are dripping wet and the lawn is soaked, and there are puddles formed in the street. Now, you didn't actually directly observe that it rained last night, but you conclude that it rained last night. And you conclude that because you're inferring it. So the way you're inferring it is, in the past you've seen, it rained, and after it rained, it usually was followed by, what it looks like outside right now. It usually, after it rains, it looks like the trees are dripping and the lawn is soaked and there's puddles in the street. And so because okay, it looks like this, so I infer that, it must have rained last night as well. So yeah, that's going to be inferential knowledge, or inferential reasoning. And so how do we, that reasoning is actually going to be vulnerable to certain counterexamples. So for instance, maybe it didn't actually rain last night. Maybe what actually happened was that a plane that was trying to fight a forest fire got lost and they accidentally dumped all the water on the street. That could also explain why it looks like it rained without it actually having rained. All right, so even though this kind of reasoning is not perfect and it's open to these counterexamples, it's still very valuable. We use this kind of reasoning all the time. So our beliefs about the future are usually going to be based on some sort of inductive reasoning. So think about this, why do you think that the sun is going to set in the west tomorrow? Well, probably because that's just how you've always seen it set. Every single day it just sets in the west, right? So why would you think that tomorrow is going to be any different? Maybe you think, oh no, it's the laws of planetary motion. But again, why do you think that the laws of planetary motion are still going to be in effect tomorrow? Again, it's because they have been in effect in the past. All right, so we can formalize this principle as the future-like-past principle, or FLP for short. The principle FLP says future states of the world are going to be like past states of the world. The argument, in short, is that we don't know anything about the future because we are not justified in believing FLP. Or in other words, FLP, we have no good reason to think FLP is true. So you can use any belief you want about the future, but for this, we're going to just use simple beliefs that I think everyone has, that the sun is going to set in the west tomorrow. So this argument can be formalized as follows. The argument against knowing the future KF1, if you're not justified in believing that FLP is true, then your belief that the sun will set tomorrow is not justified. KF2, you are not justified in believing that FLP is true. KF3, so your belief that the sun will set in the west tomorrow is unjustified. KF4, if your belief that the sun will set in the west tomorrow is unjustified, then you do not know that the sun will set in the west tomorrow. KF5, so you do not know that the sun will set in the west tomorrow. So first, KF4 is just the idea that being justified in something is like the minimum for knowing something. For instance, you might think that there are puffins here in Scotland, but this is just a guess, and you don't actually, have any evidence for it. So obviously you don't know that there are puffins here in Scotland, even if there actually are, and you are correct. It was just a guess. You don't know it. So having some sort of evidence and justification for a belief is like the bare minimum for knowing that belief. So then the other two premises, KF1 and KF2, I'm going to unpack in the next two segments. But before I get to them, I want you guys to pause the video and ask yourself, what reason do I have for believing that FLP is true, or that I'm justified in believing FLP? So the premise KF1 says that your belief that the sun will set in the west tomorrow is justified only if you have good reason for believing that FLP is true. So here's the argument in support of KF1, the faulty foundations argument. FF1, your belief that the sun will set in the west tomorrow is based on FLP. FF2, if a belief is based on something that you are not justified in believing, then that belief itself is unjustified. KF1, so if you are not justified in believing FLP is true, then your belief that the sun will set in the west tomorrow is unjustified. So to see the idea behind FF1, recall why you believe that the sun is going to set in the west tomorrow. Again, presumably it's because you've inferred it from previous sunsets. And so this reasoning is going to implicitly rely on FLP. So that means whether you mean to or not, you're going through something like the following reasoning process. In the past, the sun has always set in the west. Future states of the world will be like past states of the world, so tomorrow the sun will set in the west. So this is the same reasoning process that you go through when you were thinking about the last time you ate a whole Big Mac meal and whether you should order it again. So in the past, eating an entire extra value meal always made me sleepy. The future states of the world are like past states of the world, so eating an entire extra value meal will make you sleepy. So implicitly or explicitly, you arrive at all your beliefs about the future using some principle like this. But we shouldn't be using FLP as like this hard and fast rule. If future states were like past states, then we'd never actually progress. We would never think we could cure cancer or have flying cars. Instead, maybe we should use a more nuanced principle like the following, FLP star. Future states of the world will be like past states of the world, except in respects in which we expect them to differ. So the exact wording of the principle isn't going to be very important. What's important is that you're using some principle in your reasoning about the future. You can use FLP or FLP star in the following arguments. All right, so now let's consider the other premise in the faulty foundations argument. This is just saying that justification cannot be built on a faulty foundation. So if your reasoning for believing something is no good, then that belief itself is not going to be justified. Right, so let's consider this case. It's the power pose case. Jared is getting ready for a job interview, and he thinks that it will help his chances if he spends 5 minutes power posing. When his fiancée, Ashley, asks him why he thinks it will help, Jared tells her that science has shown that the power pose releases performance-enhancing hormones into your bloodstream. Skeptical, Ashley does a little Googling and informs Jared that the power pose study has been completely discredited and now is widely regarded as pseudoscience. So once Jared finds out that the study has been discredited, then his belief that he's getting more performance-enhancing hormones is going to be unjustified. And furthermore, any belief based on that belief is also then going to be unjustified. So it would be irrational for Jared to keep standing there in the mirror, power posing, thinking that it will continue to help him with his job interview. All right, so in the previous segment, I was saying how if FLP is unjustified, then your belief about tomorrow's sunset is also unjustified. But we really haven't established that FLP itself is unjustified yet. So we need to do that. We need to establish the premise KF2. So KF2, the idea is that there are only two ways that FLP can be justified. And since FLP cannot be justified in either one of those two ways, you're not justified in believing FLP. All right, so let's formalize that argument. FLP is unjustified. UJ1, if your belief in FLP is justified, then it is either justified by direct observation or inductive reasoning. UJ2, your belief in FLP is not justified by direct observation. UJ3, your belief in FLP is not justified by inductive reasoning. KF2, so your belief in FLP is unjustified. So to unpack this argument, I'm going to need a few segments. Here I'll explain UJ1 and UJ2, and then in the next segment I'm going to explain UJ3. So UJ1 is just that there are only two ways that we can justify a belief, either by directly observing it or by inferential reasoning. You might contend that there is another way of coming to know things, like we were talking earlier about how you know things about your internal states, your thoughts, your feelings, like those things. You might also know that triangles have three sides. But those are about the internal world or non-physical things. But FLP is about the physical world, and so FLP can only be justified in one of two ways, which is through inductive reasoning or through direct observation. All right, so now UJ2, consider how FLP is really a claim about similarity. You're saying that the past is similar to the future. And so to make any justified claims about similarities, you're going to need to actually directly observe those things. Well, I don't know how you could possibly observe the future. I don't know, maybe you get a time machine or a crystal ball or something like that. But for all of us who don't have those things, we can't directly observe the future. And so we can't use direct observation to justify FLP. All right, so then I'll go in to the other premise, UJ3, in the next segment. All right, now here's a chance for us to stop and reflect. The argument in this segment turns on the claim that induction and direct observations are the only ways of knowing about the world. Is that true? When a detective solves a crime, unlike any crime she's ever seen before, is she using resources other than induction and direct observation? If so, how might that help with resisting the argument? All right, so now let's turn to UJ3. The idea behind UJ3 is that inductive justification for FLP would be circular, and any kind of circular reasoning is bad. So we can formalize this as follows with the anti-circularity argument. AC1, all inductive reasoning about the future assumes the truth of FLP. AC2, if all inductive reasoning about the future assumes the truth of FLP, then inductive reasoning about FLP is circular. AC3, no belief can be justified by circular reasoning. UJ3, so FLP is not justified by inductive reasoning. So the case for AC1 is the same for the premise FF1 in the faulty foundations argument. All of our reasoning about the future implicitly relies on FLP in some way. So remember, think about any kind of inductive reasoning that you might do. Like every time I've run 3 miles or more, my legs were sore the next day. So if I run 3 miles or more, then my legs will be sore tomorrow. Or maybe it was like, they're mowing the lawn over here, and it's like, oh, they probably had to mow the lawn once a week. every week last summer, and so yeah, they're probably going to have to mow the lawn once a week every week this coming summer as well. So all of these lines of reasoning are just going to implicitly rely on the idea that, the past is going to be like, the future is going to be like the past. And that's exactly what just AC1 is saying. So AC2 introduces the idea of circularity. And for those of you who don't know, like a circular argument is a fallacious argument. Those are going to be bad arguments. All right, so to see the idea here, suppose it were true that inductive reasoning about future states of the world is going to assume FLP. Well, FLP itself is about future states of the world. It's saying that future states of the world are going to be like past states of the world. So it follows that inductive reasoning about FLP is going to assume FLP. In other words, FLP is both going to be a premise and a conclusion of this line of reasoning. And that's what qualifies it as circular reasoning. If it's a premise and a conclusion, then it's like justifying itself to justify itself. It's not going to work, in other words. All right, so we can formalize this as the following way. In the past, each day greatly resembled the day that preceded it. Future states of the world will be like past states of the world. So future days will resemble days in the past. The conclusion in this line of reasoning is that the future days will resemble past days, which is just another way of saying that future states of the world are going to be like past states of the world, which is the second premise in this reasoning. That means that you've got the same claim showing up as both a premise and a conclusion in this line of reasoning. And so that's going to fit our definition of circularity. All right, so if you're not totally getting it, then let's consider the case of the magic 8-ball. Manny shakes his magic 8-ball and asks whether Smitha has a crush on him, and it issues the verdict, yes. Manny's excitement lasts for only a moment, as he suddenly realizes that he has no reason to believe that the 8-ball can be trusted. So he decides to check. He shakes the 8-ball again and asks whether it can be trusted. It issues the verdict, yes. That settles it. Manny thinks to himself, the 8-ball can be trusted and Smitha has a crush on me. So the first time he shakes the 8-ball, he's implicitly relying on the following form of reasoning. It said that she has a crush on me, implicitly assuming that the 8-ball can be trusted, so she does have a crush on me. The second time he shakes the 8-ball, he's relying on circular reasoning. So that can be formalized as follows. It said that it can be trusted, implicitly assuming that an 8-ball can be trusted. It indeed can be trusted. So the diagnosis of this type of reasoning is that it's circular. The conclusion is implicitly one of the premises. And since we know that circular reasoning is a bad type of reasoning, it's not going to be able to justify any of our beliefs, which is exactly what AC3 is saying. All right, so this is going to be the argument that you don't know that the sun will set tomorrow. But again, that example was just chosen at random. You really could have chosen any belief that you have about the future. So now if KF2 is true, as we've just been talking about, then your beliefs about the future are not going to be justified. You don't know anything that is going to happen a year from now. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't even know what's going to happen in the next second. For all you know, in the very next second is when the sun's going to explode, and the entire world and everything you know is going to completely change. All right, here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. At the end of this segment, I say that the argument can be extended to all of your beliefs about the future. Is that true? Can it be used to undermine the belief that 1 + 1 will still equal 2 tomorrow? If not, why not? So the previous argument contended that you can't know anything about the future. And so now we're going to turn to our second skeptical argument, and this one's going to claim that you can't actually know anything about the present, about the physical world right in front of your eyes. And just like the previous argument where we picked a belief, but it could have been extrapolated to any number of beliefs, we can do the same thing here. So last time we chose the belief that the sun is going to set in the west tomorrow. This time we're going to attack the belief that you do not know that you're currently watching this video. All right, so this argument is going to rely on a hypothesis here. It's called the dreaming hypothesis. TDH says you are currently lying down in bed, dreaming about sitting down watching this lecture. So using this hypothesis, we can make the argument that you don't know that you're actually sitting there watching this lecture. The dreaming argument, DR1, if you have no way of knowing that TDH is false, then you have no way of knowing that you are currently watching this video. DR2, you have no way of knowing that TDH is false. DR3, so you have no way of knowing that you're currently watching this video. So notice that there's no claim that TDH is actually true. TDH is not a premise on its own in this argument. I'm not going to try and convince you that TDH is true. All I have to do is just show you that you can't know that TDH is false. All right, so I'm going to unpack these premises in the next two segments, DR1 and DR2. DR1 says that to be able to rule out that you are not in fact dreaming, you have to know that you're sitting here watching this lecture. And if you in fact know that you're sitting here watching this lecture, then you must have a way of knowing that you're not dreaming. But if you're not able to rule out the dreaming hypothesis, then it must be because you don't know that you're actually sitting here watching this video after all. All right, so to help develop this idea, we can use the notion of a deduction. So deductions are just a certain kind of reasoning. If the premises are true, then they're going to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. This is also known as like a deductive argument. And so if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows from that necessarily, which would mean that you're justified in believing that conclusion. So for example, let's say I flip a coin and I tell you that the coin did not land on heads. So then from that, you conclude that the coin landed tails. In other words, you've deduced that the coin landed tails from your other two beliefs. All right, well, with that in mind, let's consider the argument from deduction. DE1, if you know you're sitting down watching this lecture, you can deduce that TDH is false from the things you know. DE2, if you can deduce something from things you know, then you have a way of knowing that thing. DE3, so if you know you're sitting down watching this lecture, then you have a way of knowing that TDH is false. DE1 says that there would be a certain deductive chain that you could use to know if you really are sitting down watching this video. So it would go something like this. Step 1, I'm sitting down watching this video. Step 2, if I'm sitting down watching this video, then I'm sitting. Step 3, if I'm sitting, then I'm not lying down. Step 4, if I'm not lying down, then I'm not dreaming. Step 5, if I'm not dreaming, then the dreaming hypothesis is false. Step 6, so the dreaming hypothesis is false. So steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 are just conceptual truths. For instance, look at step 3. It's just saying that if you're lying down, or if you're sitting, then you're not lying down. This just comes from the definitions of sitting and lying down. So DE1 is saying that if you know the first step, then you have a way of deducing that TDH is false. All right, so now let's consider DE2. To get the idea behind this, we're going to need to consider these two cases. So case 1, I flip the coin and I tell you that it has not come up tails, and so you conclude, oh, it's landed on heads. Step 2, I flip a coin, but I don't tell you what side I don't tell you anything about the coin, and you still conclude, oh, it's landed on heads. All right, so in the first case, you can know that the coin landed heads because you can deduce it from the information you've already known. Whereas in contrast, in the second case, you cannot know that because you kind of just took a random guess. You're not deducing it from information that you've already known. All right, so now DE1 and DE2 are both together going to entail DE3. And so notice, though, that DE3 is actually the same thing as DR1. All right, so that might not have been obvious to you, but let's recall them. Let's put them next to each other. So DE3, if you know you're sitting down watching this video, then you have no way of knowing that TDH is false. DR1 says if you have no way of knowing that TDH is false, then you do not know that you are sitting down watching this video. All right, so this might not seem obvious to you, but let me give another example. Notice that the statement, if A is true, then B is true, is just another way of saying that if B is false, then A is false. You can also think about it like this. If Tom is in Scotland, then Tom is in the UK, is just another way of saying that if Tom is not in the UK, then Tom is not in Scotland. All right, so since DE3 and DR1 are saying the same thing, the argument here from deduction is going to give us support for believing that DR1 is true. All right, so now let's turn to DR2. This premise is that you can't rule out that TDH is true. Simply, the argument is that you don't have any evidence against TDH, and you can't rule anything out unless you have evidence against it. All right, so we can formalize this as the no evidence argument. Any one, if you have no evidence against something, then you have no way of knowing that it's false. Any two, you have no evidence against TDH. DR2, so you have no way of knowing that TDH is false. To see the idea here behind any one, suppose that we're at Woodstocks and a song comes on and you're like, ugh, this is Justin Bieber. And I ask you, why do you think it's Justin Bieber? And you're just like, oh, well, the song sounds poppy and the lead singer, sounds really whiny. And I say, well, okay, but there are a lot of bands that, their music sounds poppy and their lead singer sounds, whiny. Like, Shawn Mendes or Ed Sheeran. So now if you gave me more evidence, you're like, oh yeah, Justin Bieber keeps saying his name, that's how I know it's him. Or the song or the album in which it came out on. But just by the sound, you can't rule out that it's not Ed Sheeran. And just because you have no evidence that, and that's because you have no evidence against the hypothesis that it is Ed Sheeran. All right, so anyone is just saying the same thing about TDH. If you have no evidence against the hypothesis, then you cannot know that the hypothesis is false. All right, so now the idea behind any two is that TDH is actually consistent with all of the evidence we currently have. So think about what evidence you have for the idea that you're sitting here watching this video. It looks like your legs are bent in your sitting position on top of a chair or a couch, right? And it feels like you're paying attention to me. Maybe it even feels like you have a pen in your hand and you're writing down notes. Hopefully you are. Yet, all of that evidence is still going to be compatible with the idea that we're lying down dreaming. If you were dreaming, it would look and feel all the exact same. The fact that it looks and feels like you're sitting down paying attention to this lecture is hardly evidence that you are actually doing that. Merely dreaming, you could just be merely dreaming that you're sitting down paying attention to this lecture. So in other words, you have no evidence that TDH is false. So now you might think, well, couldn't this argument just be used against TDH? Since you have no evidence that TDH is true, you have no way of knowing that TDH is true. So we can formalize this as the flipped evidence argument. FE1, if you have no evidence for something, then you have no way of knowing that it's true. FE2, you have no evidence for TDH. FE3, so you have no way of knowing that TDH is true. However, this is not going to be a problem for the argument. As we said, the argument is not trying to establish that TDH is actually true, or even probably true. The argument just needs to establish that you cannot know that TDH is false. And this is exactly what the no evidence argument gives us. All right, so you might still be thinking, well, there still seems to be some tension here between DR2 and FE3. It seems like they contradict each other. So how can we really rationally hold both of these together? But they're not actually contradictory. That's part of the problem. So it would be contradictory to say that the dreaming hypothesis is true and is not true. That's an explicit contradiction. Or that we can and cannot know that TDH is true. That's another explicit contradiction. But instead what we're getting is that we have no way of knowing one way or the other whether TDH is true or false. All right, here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. Are you convinced by the no evidence argument? Can you sometimes dismiss a hypothesis out of hand without any evidence against it? If so, which ones and why? thinking that there is a difference between dreams and waking life. Dreams tend to be blurry and nonsensical, whereas waking life tends to be vivid and quite coherent. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this could be evidence that I'm actually sitting here watching this video. It feels very vivid and coherent. Hopefully it feels coherent. Which this would mean that it's the premise NE2 of the no evidence argument is going to be false. So then the conclusion, DR2, is going to be left unsupported and possibly false, which could then undermine the dreaming argument. So the idea is that you know that the dreaming hypothesis is false by attending to the vividness of your current experience. So in response, we might just be able to modify TDH. TDH plus says you're currently lying down in bed, dreaming about sitting down watching a philosophy lecture, and it's the most incredibly vivid dream you've ever had. So now you can't rely on your vividness of your experience to undermine TDH because it can't be used against TDH plus. Having a very vivid experience is exactly what TDH plus says that you are currently having. So the vividness of the experience, again, it's not going to be able to be used here. So we can sidestep the vividness objection here by replacing TDH with TDH plus throughout the argument. And this strategy seems like it would work for similar objections as well. For instance, you might object that you're not dreaming because you've never heard of such arguments before. But then we could just modify TDH to say that you are currently a brilliant philosophy professor who is just dreaming that they're an undergrad learning about these arguments for the first time. Or maybe you are just dreaming about these arguments, and in the dream it feels like it's all coherent, it feels like it's all working together, but when you wake up you're going to realize that, oh, this is all just gobbledygook. So by now it should hopefully be fairly clear that whatever test you come up with, we can just modify TDH to get around that test, and you can never really know that TDH is actually false. So the tests you kind of might be thinking about are like, the pinching test, like, you pinch yourself to see if you're awake, or sometimes people think flipping on light switches on and off will help, or looking at digital clocks. One student allegedly argued that if you aren't sure whether you're dreaming or not, you should try and go pee. And if you still have the feeling that you have to go pee, then that tells you that you only peed in your dream, and so you're just dreaming. That's really clever, but I'm still not sure that's going to work. So since you might be thinking that these objections are going to work against TDH or any of the modifications, maybe it's better if we just address it straight on with an argument. So pick whichever test you want, the pinching test, the light test, whatever, and we're just going to call those a dreaming test. And we want to make sure that we're using a reliable dreaming test. That means that it's always going to give us the right answer. So when you're sleeping and you use a dreaming test, it's going to tell you that you're sleeping. And when you're awake and you use the dreaming test, it's going to tell you that you're awake. So again, it's always giving you the correct answer. All right, well, with that in mind, let's consider the no useful test argument. NU1, if you don't know that your dreaming test is reliable, then you can't know whether you're dreaming by using it. NU2, you can never know that your dreaming test is reliable. NU3, so you can never know whether you're dreaming by using your dreaming test. So NU1 says that in order to know whether you're dreaming or not by using the dreaming test, you already have to know that the dreaming test is reliable. When I ask you, hey, how do you know that you're dreaming or not right now? And you say, well, I spun a top and it fell over, as opposed to just spinning forever. And I'd say, well, how do you know that that test is actually reliable? And you'd say, well, I saw it in a movie and it worked for them. And it's like, yeah, but how do you actually know that it's reliable in this world right here? Maybe you're dreaming and it's, only reliable sometimes. So yeah, NU1 is just saying that unless you already know that the test is reliable, then you can't use that test to determine whether you're dreaming or not. So NU2 is going to say that you'll never be able to tell whether your dreaming test is reliable. So the idea is that for you to know that your dreaming test is reliable, you have to know that the test has actually worked in the past. That in those times when you were dreaming, it correctly told you were dreaming, and when you were awake, it correctly told you that you were awake. And you might be thinking, okay, so yesterday I went to the gym and I pinched myself and I felt it. And then last night I was sleeping and I pinched myself and I didn't feel it. And then I woke up again this morning and I pinched myself and I felt it. However, that line of reasoning just presupposes that you were already awake in the first and third instances. For all you know, you were already dreaming. And you just dreamt that you woke up this morning and you're still in that dream. And suppose that the waking is merely a dream within a dream that just came to an end. And maybe it's even worse than that. Maybe it's been more like for the last 15 years, you've just been in a coma and you've been shifting between this dream and the coma and the dreams within the dreams and the coma. And in the dream state of the coma, you can feel the pinching. And then in the dream within the dream, you're not going to be able to feel the pinching. But it still doesn't mean that you're actually awake in the real world. And you have no way of ruling this out. And so if you can't rule that out, then you can't know that your reasons for thinking that your pinching tests are reliable are actually any good. And if you can't know that your reasons for thinking that your test is reliable are any good, then you can't know that the pinching test is actually reliable. And that's the same for pretty much any dreaming test, which is exactly what NU2 is saying. So that's it. Those are the two skeptical arguments that give us reason for thinking that we don't have any knowledge. The first is that we don't know anything about the future, and the second is that we don't know anything about the physical present right in front of us. Now, we can't know anything about the future because all of our beliefs about the future are going to be based on the assumption that we have no good reason for accepting. Specifically, the assumption that future states are going to be like past states of the world. And you can't know that you're presently here, physically in the world, because you can't rule out the possibility that all of your present experiences are just part of one massive, vivid dream. All right, so now we have 3 reflection questions to end this lecture with. Do you have any evidence that the dreaming hypothesis is false? If so, what is it? If the evidence takes the form of a test, how would you respond to the no useful test argument? Can you think of ways of modifying some of the arguments from this chapter to produce an argument that we can't know anything about the past? Finally, I argued that no one knows anything about the world. Are my arguments self-defeating? Can they also be used to show that I don't know that no one knows anything about the world? If so, is that a problem? If not, why not? So bonus points for anyone who can tell me why I recorded in front of this guy.